I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of the Top 10 of the 2010s. And this week, we're going to be breaking down my list of the top 10 biopics of the decade, the second part in the three-part list series. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is talk about some of my favorite movies of the decade. Right now, we are at the tail end of the series. This is going to be my second last list. But essentially how the lists work is I give my picks from 1 to 10. With the first week being my picks from 10 to 7, the next week being my picks from 6 to 2, and then finally a full video on what I think is the best action movie of the decade, the best romantic movie of the decade, and give my thoughts in a full breakdown video. But for these episodes with multiple movies I talk about, you can check the description for timestamps if you want to jump around and hear my thoughts on different types of movies. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a video, and next week you can see what my pick is for the best biopic of the decade, and then after that we're going to start the top 10 best picture winners of the decade list before we eventually sort of transition back into the old Oscar countdown series around mid-December. But without further ado, jumping into my number 6 pick, it's going to be Steve Jobs.
Make everything all right with Lisa. Fix it!
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome
From writer Aaron Sorkin and director Danny Boyle, this odd pairing delivered one of the most emotional and intense biopics of the decade. About business legend and Apple CEO co-founder Steve Jobs, as the title suggests. The play is structured in 3 distinct acts. The first, taking place in 1984, right before Apple, when Steve is part of it, is about to launch the Mac. And then in 1988, when Steve leaves the company and joins Next, starts his new company called Next, and then all the way back into 1998 for the third act, when Steve has rejoined the company. And the movie is very much structured like a play. It has these 3 very distinct acts in distinct time periods, always happening with a similar sort of cohort of characters right before a product launch. And a lot of people sort of have criticized it because of that, but also sort of have praised it because of some of those elements. And, and other elements such as, the same characters reappearing, it being a very much dialogue-based film. It definitely feels in certain ways like a play, but definitely an adapted play. Even though it's not even a play in the first part, it definitely feels like that. But I think that's actually a positive, that those play-like elements do transfer well to the sort of structure and telling of the story. The dialogue is Sorkin classic, with people always coming up to Steve right before the product launch. So we have this sort of time crunch because there's a product launch in 30 minutes and there's all these problems and people have to solve this problem. So it has this sort of antsy, nervous energy that Steve probably in real life would have to face, because people are always asking him questions because he's sort of the head of the company, and lots of things have to go past him and go through him before they sort of get approved. But also the filmmaking style of this employs the traditional sort of walk and talk, constantly following characters through door frames, through elevators, and having this sort of back and forth with really rapid dialogue, more than I think in any other Sorkin film. And in that dialogue, we understand the sort of atmosphere and tone of this movie, that it's a frantic movie, it's an intense movie, things are happening all the time, and sort of puts you in the mindset of Steve and all the things he has to deal with by being such a rapid paced dialogue and delivery. It feels like everything's sort of coming in at once. But what's smart about it is actually tells us a lot about the different relationships that he has. The way Steve reacts to different people tells us through the dialogue what he's like with other people. For example, he's a little bit more hostile towards Andy Hershowitz. For example, he's a little bit more threatening to Andy Hertzfeld, or a little bit more calm to a co-founder along with him, Steve Wozniak, or his assistant, who a little bit fights a little bit more back to Steve's demanding kind of bullying scenarios. But through this dialogue, through this sort of different relationships that he has, through different characters throughout the movie, we understand more about Steve, the man himself, but also his different relationships with people. That he's not just this one sort of person who's just an asshole kind of to everybody. He does have these sort of different relationships with different people, and that sort of complexity of the man is portrayed through the dialogue and through the different types of deliveries that Michael Fassbender gives, but also the different types of pace of the dialogue, which Sorkin does a smart thing here within the script. So it's this sort of practical element where it makes sense in the structure of the film that there's all these problems that are happening right before the product launch, so they need to go to Steve, but also through the dialogue we understand that relationships a lot better. So this allows for a lot also as being practical, but also being dramatically relevant, and that the dramatic tension in this movie is so heightened. Realistically, probably these problems wouldn't happen right before the launch or 30 minutes or so, but it feels like that through the rapid-paced dialogue. So everything comes up in terms of the dramatic tension while still serving the characters in the story. So it may even be a more apt comparison to say this is not necessarily a play, but in a way a sort of opera, a filmed opera, just by the amount of dramatic stakes that are going on and the pressure that is on Steve. But for as much as the movie gets criticized or praised as being this sort of play-like movie, I also think it's worth mentioning all the contributions that Danny Boyle makes to it being a great film. For example, in the 3 different periods, using 3 different filmmaking techniques, using 16mm film in the first part, then 35, and then digital for the last, showing the sort of evolution of Apple, which is maybe not something that you pick up on the first time, but I think actually applies a subconscious view to making the period films feel a little bit more period and older and accurate, and the more modern version, the final third act, feel a little bit more modern and to today's date, and showing the growth of Steve as a character. And also, I think there's some really terrific cross-cutting in here, particularly one scene where John Scully, played by Jeff Daniels, and Steve go back and forth about the firing of him from Apple. And we get this sort of great cross-cutting where we get the two yelling as the music swells in the person, but we also get to see the scene happen. We get to see the sort of actual firing itself, as well as the reflection of it. So we get the sort of talking about it, then seeing the event, then hearing different sides, and allows us for this unique perspective change, while also building up the emotional value, that the stakes are high because in both scenes they sort of both equally ramp up to Steve eventually becoming firing, and then that reflection later on confronting John Scully about why he was fired, and sort of the arguments and different perspectives that they have here. It's just little ways like this what allow to bring in the backstory that say a play wouldn't be able to do. So it's really a movie with terrific camera. It's a great script, but it's executed intelligently. The dialogue works to not only add to the pace as well as the tracking camera, but also works for the emotional engagement that, especially on multiple rewatches, the engagement between Steve and his daughter, even just Steve and his other relationships, definitely work a lot more on that second time. Plus the small, sort of smart decision-making techniques, the cross-cutting, things like that, that Danny Boyle brings to the table, as well as the top sort of amazing ensemble performances from Kate Winslet, Michael Fassbender, Jeff Daniels. Really everyone is terrific in the movie and worthy of these sort of unique different people within the real life sphere and play their real life people accurately. So it's structured like a film play, and maybe in a certain way a film play, but so what? I don't think a play like, if it was just a play, would have the sort of momentum that this has, wouldn't be able to do the cross-cutting to show the backstory, wouldn't be able to actually visualize it, and the antsiness with the tracking camera that this does. And if anything, it's just a play that we get to see that's filmed and preserved for eternity. So Steve Jobs is a terrific movie. Give it a rewatch if you haven't seen it. I think it's very much ambitious, and it executes on that ambition. Kind of an underrated biopic of the decade, but if you haven't checked out Steve Jobs, definitely do. And then my number 5 pick is going to be McFarland USA.
With that kind of strength. These kids have the biggest hearts I've ever seen. Uno, dos, tres, McFarland!
An overlooked movie of this decade, and really the sort of last gasp breath of these sort of Disney sports movies. See, in the 90s and early 2000s, I think that's when Disney sports movies were really at their peak, with movies like Remember the Titans or Invincible or Miracle. It's this sort of formulaic thing that Disney has really, for the most part, established and executed using different types of sports, whether it be hockey, football, you name it. So finally, we're getting to this final sort of evolution in cross-country, but in a way, these movies aren't getting made as much because people just haven't been seeing them. That being said, the reason why this movie is so high on this list is because A, I'm a fan of these sports movies. I think this is actually one of the better ones that they've done, and I'm very interested in the content of cross-country running, having done cross-country running in my past. Now, I talked about this idea of formula on last week's episode with Ford v Ferrari, which I thought was a movie that felt old-fashioned, but was entertaining and engaging because of the modern elements that it brought. That it was a great balance between the old-fashioned and the modern, that it did a lot of modern things to make it feel entertaining while still making it look old-fashioned. That perfect balance I thought Ford v Ferrari hit. I think that in a similar way hits here. That the Disney formula we've sort of seen a bunch of times. We've seen the sort of sports movie where it's the underdog who goes against these great tasks that has a lot of roadblocks but comes in under the end and comes out achievement, and it's a sports miracle and everybody's happy and freeze frame, roll credits. We've seen this formula done many times before, but there's many times that the formula maybe gets a little bit too much credit, in the sense that you can't just do it like a normal formula and expect it to work. That the emotions have to hit, because it's the end has to be such an emotionally rewarding kind of a movie, an emotionally rewarding moment. The build-up has to be there, and it can't just be a formula with basic stuff, because if you're not emotionally invested in the characters, by the end of the movie, that emotional impact isn't there, and then at the end you're just like, oh, that's a formulaic Disney movie. Then in a lot of ways, the best formulaic Disney movies you don't even realize are formulaic, because it's got this sort of traditional great structure and format of the underdog who rises and has a training montage and then finally beats it. But also, I think it's the additional elements that adds to it. And I think with this, a lot of it has to do with performances and the different sort of setting and what the story actually is. And this one, it's about this football coach named Jim White, who moves to this new town, which is largely Hispanic. Jim White's played by Kevin Costner in the sort of traditional coach role that he's done a few times now, but he's the best at it, and I think this is one of his best kind of coach performances in here. He's got the traditional sort of stoic humility that adds to the motivational elements, and he can deliver a speech like no other that gets these kids and even the audience member willing to run through a wall for this guy. But what I think that is interesting about the movie is that the performance with Kevin Costner is really key and really central, but a lot of it can be at least perceived on the outside as this idea of a white savior movie. That this guy, Jim White, is moving to the Hispanic town and helps them coach and gets them into the sort of cross-country respect in terms of states and whatnot, and he's sort of the main guy that helps them through their poverty or whatnot. But I don't think that's the situation here. That it could have been that, but the actual sort of delicate deftness that this is portrayed with, I think is quite sophisticated, smart, and does well to the story. Particularly with the fact that this community doesn't need him. That it's very much often expressed to him that they don't need him, and frankly, they don't want him. That the Hispanic community is doing well themselves. They're helping each other with the family and going to school, and everything is going fine. And that's actually the one. It's Jim White is the one who used to be a football coach, and now sort of got moved to the school, and his wife isn't too happy about it. But she's sort of making the best out of it, and now, because he sees the potential with these kids running to school, decides to actually start up a cross-country team. That he has to sort of go out, reach out to the community, explain himself through communication, sort of break down that racial bias, try to break down and try to understand everyone's perspective through empathy and communication, that they're able to finally come together into being a full team. But there is those moments of tension that come throughout the movie, but I think the movie and the director, Nicky Caro, are really able to focus on these moments and stress these moments where they're just communication, where they have these tough conversations, to just get past that and to try to avoid it from being that sort of white savior movie. And I think it does that very aptly. And also, the key fact of this movie is just how much the community is involved. Because this is a small town in California, there's not that many residents. So when they do have success, when these boys do start doing well in their cross-country races, I think that they're able to really rally around these boys and really create a sense of community and belonging and of wholesomeness that you can get out of this sort of a movie. And I must say, as a cross-country runner myself throughout high school, I was really impressed at the little details that they were able to get right. The sort of hill that always gets people at the end, the people who go too fast at the beginning, the people who have that sort of traditional practice pace. They understand the sort of trials and tribulations. And I always thought running as a great sports kind of a movie sport, because baseball we've seen a lot of, boxing we've seen a lot of, but similarly with running, it's all about the mental game. That's not necessarily the physical aspects. That oftentimes it's just pushing harder and wanting that win more than your opponent, and it's an individual sport the same way boxing is, for example. So with a classic, stoic, humble Costner performance, with a great ensemble of young Hispanic actors that really rise together to add on top of the traditional Disney formula, works well, deals with those sort of race relations with a deft hand. And I think if you like the sort of movies like Remember the Titans, or if you're a sports fan, I think even if you're not a running fan or a cross-country fan, you'll be surprised at how much you enjoy this and how sort of a wholesome, great content this is. And even though we don't get these sort of sports movies anymore, even though though they're sort of looked down upon by a lot of people, I really appreciate them. And I think by the end of McFarland USA, you would be wanting to run out for a mile. It just has that sort of inspiration and that great ending that you love to see. So definitely check out McFarland USA. It was a little bit overlooked, but definitely worth your time. And then my number 4 pick is going to be Bridge of Spies.
What's the move when you don't know what the game is?
The next mistake our countries make could be the last one.
Another underrated movie like McFarland, but McFarland I would classify more as an overlooked movie because just not a lot of people have seen it. But Bridge of Spies had a great Oscar campaign, and for a lot of people is known for that. It was nominated for a bunch of Oscars, including Best Picture, and won for Best Supporting Actor in the surprise win, beating out fan favorite Sylvester Stallone for Creed. So I think a lot of people's reactions to this movie is, oh, that's the one that beat out Sly for Creed? Oh, screw that movie, I don't like that movie. Mark Rylance, who? Get him out of here. Because I think without even seeing it or without further examination, a lot of people see Bridge of Spies as being this sort of stately Oscar drama. It's Spielberg, it's Hanks, it's a period piece, Cold War, it's about a good guy, and it sort of just can be easily categorized as, oh, it's just one of those Oscar movies that are probably boring and stale, and they put it into one category. But as a matter of fact, I think this is a total masterclass in directing and one of the top 10 Spielberg movies, which for any other director wouldn't be a lot to say, but for someone like Steven Spielberg is a high praise on my part. A movie all about dialogue, negotiation, and political dealings, but dealt with the thriller elements of a spy thriller, the emotion of a rom-com, and the action of a war movie all together in this incredibly packaged, well, interesting adult drama that's more than just your stately Oscar drama. About a lawyer named James Donovan who is asked by the US government to represent a Russian spy named Rudolph Abels, and this is the height of the Cold War, the communist Red Scare. No one likes communism, so the assumption being that James Donovan is just to sort of roll over and get this guy a bunch of years in jail, and that's it. But when he starts to actually represent his client as you're supposed to do according to the law, he gets a lot of pushback. And then in that sort of part of the movie, it's about the sort of pushback he gets for representing a Russian spy. But then later on in the movie, it starts to transform. It goes from this sort of legal thriller to sort of a spy thriller to sort of a political espionage movie. It really transforms. I think that this could have easily, say, been a miniseries, but what's so great about the movie, it's taking all the bad parts of a miniseries, the sort of slog of a miniseries, and putting it together in one movie, which is something we just don't see that often. That if it can be told in, say, 4 or 5 parts, it will be for TV, instead of it being really chopped down and perfect and made to the sort of 2.5-hour movie here with Bridge of Spies. And Spielberg is mostly known for his adventure movies, Jaws, Jurassic Park, War of the Worlds, Indiana Jones, what have you. But I think in the later part of his career, he's gone away from those adventure films and becoming more interested in these sort of morally gray, complex movies about men, just normal men doing heroic things, but the sort of moral gray areas of that, whether it be Munich or Lincoln or something like Bridge of Spies. But I think he's very good at that because it could have easily just been, like I said, an Oscar stately kind of boring drama. It's directed by Steven Spielberg, so it's injected with all that adventure filmmaking that he's able to, has learned throughout the years. I mean, he's the master of that. And I think for a lot of people, there's a difference between entertainment and art. That a movie either has to be entertaining or it has to be artful, and that it's either entertaining or boring and interesting, or entertaining and dull. But what Spielberg's able to do, and he's one of the few that's able to do it, I think, is really combine the two. Now, that's not to say they can't be combined. A lot of Spielberg's movies do combine them together, including Bridge of Spies. It has the action set pieces and the constantly moving camera and the sort of fast pace that you would get in, say, an adventure action movie, but has some of the more complex political elements and the moral elements and sort of moralistically gray areas that you'd see in, say, an Oscar type movie. But also, it's so clear what makes Spielberg a great director when you see a movie like this, and you see why he's such a great director is really because of the choices he makes. Because he works with so many great people doing so much great work, but really it's how to tell this story and the small little things that he adds to it that just sort of help us understand the world, help us understand the characters, and ultimately become more invested in the story. For example, in the opening shot of the movie, we get this very opening shot in the movie, we get Rudolph Abels looking at a mirror, then looking at his canvas, and the sort of back and forth, clearly sort of representing the duality of who he is. Is he a spy? Is he who he says he is? We sort of get this sort of dual, the Rudolph Abels that maybe he's portraying, and then the real Rudolph Abels and who is who. And now that's not explained to you in any way. That's not said to us through dialogue or anything. It's just a visual image, and that striking visual image is the opening and is sort of in a lot of ways the thesis for the movie when we go on into learning more about Abels and James Donovan and the story. And then other scenario, for example, Tom Hanks, who plays James Donovan, he has sort of a cold throughout the movie. Not a big one, he just has sort of a sniffle that's getting him a little bit down, that has him a little bit more exhausted, and gives his lines, and gives a reason for his lines to be a little bit apathetic and blunt. But it's small little things you don't really pick up maybe on the first time. Just that he has a slight cold. It's just a little detail that adds a lot to his character. So that opening shot, the sniffling of the nose, and then something like the Germans, when we hear the Germans speak, we don't get any subtitles. So it puts us in the character of James Donovan, so we don't understand what they're saying, so it makes us more confused. So it's all these small details that make Spielberg such a great director. It's these small details throughout that are made in each little scene. The perfect length of shot, the amount, the little things that he does to make us relate to the characters or understand the story a little bit better throughout the movie, that when you're watching this movie, it's just a total masterclass from every element. And, I haven't even talked about the patriotic score from Thomas Newman, the terrific supporting cast that really builds out this world, the sort of cold, dreary pools of light cinematography that Janusz Kaminski has made famous now. It's all these technical elements that Spielberg is able to bring all the best people and clearly communicate it, but it's these decisions that he makes ultimately at the end of the day that other directors aren't able to do, while also creating a story that could have been told in a boring, dramatic way and imbuing it with action-style filmmaking, entertainment, how he's creating these negotiation scenes that seem like action scenes, but there's still this sort of complex sort of moral elements, even though in his old movies, it would just be good and bad, but now it's words and people. And that, for some people, isn't as exciting or glossy, but for me, I can still see the technical craft, and I'm still incredibly invested and engaged with the movie, especially when this is not a boring movie. There's about 3 movies within this movie at once. It's constant moving. Things are always happening, and you're always sort of getting back engaged into this world. A great movie, one about protecting the system, the laws within it, how powerful conversation can be, and the power of negotiation. If you haven't seen Bridge of Spies, it's more than what you think it is. It's a total masterclass. It's a top 10 Spielberg movie. Definitely check out or rewatch Bridge of Spies. Then the third pick I'm going to be talking about here is going to be last year's A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood.
I think the best thing we can do is to let people know, that each one of them is precious.
Another Tom Hanks movie, and one of my favorites from last year. Sort of got pigeonholed similarly to Bridge of Spies as an Oscar movie where this great actor Tom Hanks plays a real life person, and we've seen Bridge of Spies, and we've seen Sully, and we've seen Captain Phillips, and all these sort of movies where Tom Hanks plays real life people. But in here, it's really a terrific movie, and I think maybe the best out of all of his sort of real life portrayal movies, I think here with A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. Now, it didn't get the sort of respect that something like A Bridge of Spies did with getting an Oscar win. It only got 1 nomination for Tom Hanks for playing Mr. Rogers. But if you don't know, the movie is about Mr. Rogers, a children's show entertainer, and instead of it being a traditional biopic, a life and death just about Mr. Rogers, it's actually told from the perspective of Lloyd Vogel, who is in real life known as Tom Janode, but they sort of changed his name because not all the details are totally accurate, so they decided to change his name. But throughout the movie, in a way, it's structured like a Mr. Rogers show, trying to help Lloyd with his father, his sort of relationship with him, mending that and learning to forgive. Now, so many movies are interested in the other, in the evil, in the sort of devilishness. But I think this movie, what's so interesting and fascinating to me about this movie is that it's interested in the nice, in the kind. That David Fincher has built a career on looking at these sort of seedy, cynical elements of serial killers and what makes those people tick. And those have been successful. And even look at true crime documentaries. So many of these movies are about serial killers or the other, because I think a lot of people are fascinated in the other. They're interested in, well, what is it like being someone like that? I can't really think of killing someone in this horrific way. I want to learn more about that. But we really haven't seen the opposite side of that. We really haven't seen how is it to be so nice or so kind, and how difficult that is to achieve in a way that is a sort of other element that I've always been really fascinated with, and really blew me away with this just by taking a different perspective on that through the character of Mr. Rogers. Now, I really appreciate the structure. I think some people can see it as tired and whatnot, but I think it really works well here for the character of Mr. Rogers, because Mr. Rogers is not a great character with a lot of flaws, that he's for the most part just a really nice guy with some things that you can hint at, but it wouldn't work as sort of life and death kind of a movie. He's not that much of an interesting protagonist. So instead, we get it from a flawed protagonist here in Lloyd Vogel, a sort of cynical journal who doesn't like his father and is trying to, through Mr. Rogers, help and repair that relationship. So with this, we allow the sort of mythical nature of Mr. Rogers to still maintain, because he's a supporting character. We only have to see a little bit of him. Well, not a little bit. I mean, he's the supporting character. He's in most of the movie, but it's not necessarily about him. Now, he's sort of the guide, the sort of older wisdom, samurai, kind of sensei kind of a figure that guides Lloyd in his journey. But that doesn't mean we don't have the scenes where we get to at least hint at some of Mr. Rogers' feelings, his relationship with his son. We often see his defense mechanisms that he puts out when he's unable to deal with difficult conversations. So there's these interesting moments throughout the film but for the most part, the structure of the movie works because we're able to see a change through Lloyd Vogel's character, while Mr. Rogers still understanding a little bit more of the human aspect of him, but still keeping that mythical figure that really works also well with the film. And a lot of it is these moments of magic. That there's one scene that I particularly like where they're in a restaurant and it's a really bold decision just to have a moment of silence, 1 minute. And they take the full 1 minute and it's just quiet and there's no noise or minimal noise in the restaurant, and we just hold on the two men, go a little bit around the restaurant, see their reactions, and just pan in and wait a full minute, allowing you to sort of breathe and work. And I think that for so many people, for so many movies, if you're watching this at home, you're on your phone, you don't even realize the impact of that. But as a filmmaking tool, if you're watching the movie and you're engaged, and even watching it in the theater even more, it is so much more impactful, because you always think of a movie, it's always so constant pace, you're always sort of used to getting fed information, that there's this small moment of just breathing, of reflection, of trying to forgive, of trying to have some sort of critical analyzing, just through this moment of silence. It adds a sereneness that adds to the sort of myth, but the also ultimate philosophy and belief of Mr. Rogers. There's also these little great elements of surrealism throughout the movie, that it's not just a traditional biopic, that there is some sort of fantastical element that they do when Lloyd is having this sort of panic attack and anxiety attack that he has. But I think Tom Hanks, through his performance as Fred, really conveys a lot of that. Just through the way he delivers his lines, his calmness, and the way he says things. Everything's very calming. He's able to simplify things in such sort of poetic, kind of quote-worthy moments that are just a way of viewing the world. And the exploration into this kindness is not just saying that, hey, there's this really perfect, kind guy. It's about his process, about how he really tries, that he does sort of have these moments where it's difficult for him to relate to Lloyd, or he's trying to get to him, and there's sort of a barrier that they have. But it's about the process. It's about him really trying to become that anyone could become this nice. But it's still a process, that he still works on it, that he still does have anger issues. But for the most part, like I said, still keeping that myth alive, but still at least hinting and revealing it as some of his issues. But it's trying to explore this idea of kindness and niceness, and it's how simple it could be on a poster card, but we're really confronted with it. It's really emotionally revelatory. And I think in this age of Deadpool and Enola Holmes, the breaking of the fourth wall, the sort of snarky, cunning movies that are funny, very much so, but I think they're emotionally limiting. That you can't go on one hand and really expect me to totally invest and invest in the scene, and then you cut and you break to the fourth wall and you say something snarky, and then you sort of acknowledge that it's a movie, but there's still sort of a surface there, a barrier that you're putting up with the audience from actually truly confronting with the emotional reality of the scene. So while it can be funny and fun, it definitely limits those emotions. So it's so amazing to see a movie like this, which is so interested in those emotions. It's taking itself completely 100% seriously. It could have been an easy, snarky, oh, look at Mr. Rogers. He's this kind of funny, kind guy that acts like a kid that's so great with kids. But instead, it's trying to confront it as like this sort of philosophy that you should believe, that it's really just talking about emotions, just the bare idea of emotions, and confronting it head on. And, you know, if you're comparing it to, say, another movie, in something like Good Will Hunting, when Robin Williams is really trying to get Matt Damon's character to sort of have that therapeutic moment, he sort of breaks down the defense mechanisms of jokes of the Matt Damon and really tries to get to that heart, the emotional element that he's sort of been protecting. So when we see a movie like this that's not interested in putting up a wall, that sort of is interested in pursuing and breaking down Lloyd Vogel's character, Lloyd Vogel, his insecurities, his relationship problems with his father, and some of his past trauma. And just trying to confront emotions in general, it's really stunning. I mean, it's emotionally stunting, it's emotionally stunning, and just to see a movie that's so raw and so interested in confronting emotions that it becomes an emotionally revelatory experience. At least it was for me, and it was just like this wave of emotions because it's taking it so seriously, because it's really just trying to confront it and trying to analyze this basic idea of emotion, of kindness, of doing the right thing. And through the performance of Tom Hanks, who really embodies Mr. Rogers, through Marielle Heller and her sort of pitch-perfect pacing and decisions and elements to add in a little bit more of the surreal within the realistic, it's really just a perfect movie all around. It's a movie I've seen multiple times since, and always brings a tear to my eye and always overwhelms you with that amount of emotion. So if you haven't checked out A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, maybe you missed it from last year, check out my Connors video where I really break down, because it won a couple categories last year in the 2019 Connors, or what's been the 2020 Connors actually, but definitely check it out if you haven't. It's definitely worth your time. Then the final movie I'm going to be talking about on this list is arguably the best movie of the decade, The Social Network.
We don't need him.
You're going to get left behind. It's moving faster than
What
any of us
get
imagined it
left
would
behind?
You're being accused of breaching security, violating individual privacy.
Your best friend is suing you for $600 million.
I didn't know that. Tell me more.
I think from a critical perspective and just a commercial legacy perspective, I think the consensus amongst sort of fans and especially critics is that The Social Network is the best movie of the decade. Yet, Connor, why is it only your number 2 biopic of the decade list? But it's still a great movie. I still love the movie. It's a movie I've seen a bunch of times. And listen, it's number 2 on this list. And number 1 is one of my favorite movies of the decade. So it's sort of on that cusp of one of my favorite movies of the decade, and actually may show up on that list. But I think it's rightfully so one of the sort of most critically acclaimed movies of the decade, especially because of this 10-year gap that we're able to have with the movie. We're really able to understand its legacy and how it's changed over the years, because it is a movie that has changed. About the rise of Facebook being a college social app to being a global phenomenon, and the man who made it, Mark Zuckerberg. When I think about the movie, I think about how much of an achievement it is. You know, for so many great movies like Casablanca are just these movies that everything comes together, that everyone is working at their best, at the prime of their careers, with the right script at the right time, and just everything comes together. And if you know and talk to other filmmakers, they talk about how many things are going on. So if just one thing goes wrong, it can really tank a movie. So in a way, just a good movie is a miracle, because everything sort of comes together and works. But then when you get a movie that's like this, that's special, which is the best work of everybody coming together at the perfect right time, it really does feel like a special movie in that sense, and works at the sort of very particular moment in society, very much a 2010 movie, but also using its structure to allow it to be sort of a great classic of a movie. Now, what I mean is that the basic elements of the internet is very much modern idea. That the 20th century gave us cars and the family ideal and telephones. The 21st century, its main contribution, of course, was the internet. That changed entertainment and politics and the way we consume information and the way our social lives have. I mean, it's really a game-changing moment. But for this time, at the beginning, the internet was kind of a wild scenario. Everyone was trying to develop their own pillar, and now we have the sort of pillars of the internet: the Google, the Facebook, the Netflix, the Apples, and Facebook is really a large pillar of that. And this is the story of building that pillar, of going from the wild, wild west and the sort of chaotic element of that, with, of course, the structure being the legal battle, and sort of going back and forth with the rise, but within the legal battles that Mark Zuckerberg is going on. That's sort of the structure of the movie. But with all the sort of modern sensibilities of that, of claiming the internet and the recklessness that got to it, and the young people that ultimately dominated the most important invention of maybe all time, what's even more important is how the movie is able to balance that with a classical storytelling structure. That this is very much like Lawrence of Arabia or Citizen Kane. That is a man driven for his goals. That is a Greek tragedy. It's about a rise and a fall. But this movie is a little bit different because the fall doesn't necessarily happen in the way we think it does. Mark Zuckerberg is still one of the richest people in the world. He's a billionaire. Facebook is still totally relevant. So in 2010, what was there to need to be said? What was there that needed to be sort of fall down when it's all about the rise? And that's why I think the legal element really brings it into. It's really about how the sort of rise to the top can become lonely. That there's so many ways that you can sort of break your ethics, break your principles, that in order to get to the next top, you have to leave some people behind, and at the top, maybe you're sort of lonely and empty there. But also about driven and being ambitious, and ambition in itself, that similar to something like Citizen Kane, there are these men that are driven for one thing and they don't necessarily even know where the end is going to be, but in a way they're destined for greatness, but they're also destined for a tragic end. That these type of men are so driven and totally desired for this one fact. And in this scenario, it's not the paper industry with Citizen Kane based on William Randolph Hearst. It is based on Facebook. It's based on the internet, and it's very much an internet movie. It's about these young people taking over, coming out of college, saying, "I'm CEO, bitch." All these little things that make it about the parties and the women, but also particularly being young and having that young perspective. The young going against the traditional old corporate world and this sort of tech outfit versus a suit, and that sort of battle that's going on that we even see today, but I think is a defining element that's really captured within this movie, but a defining element of the 21st century and the internet, and how the internet really belonged to the young people. They were the ones that made it and developed it and really became that pillar, was the young people, was someone like Mark Zuckerberg. But at the end of the day, it's very much more classic because, like I said, of that story structure, but also because of what Mark is driven by. He's driven by ambition, but he's also driven by basic human needs, to be loved, to be accepted. That at the end of the movie, we just see him refreshing that Facebook page of Erica. That's sort of beginning and ending of the movie. That it doesn't matter how much money he has, he doesn't matter all the friends he had, he's still sort of refreshing the page and using the site the way he thought other people would use it. And in a way, even though he is the creator, he's also the user. And the two main creative forces in this movie, being Aaron Sorkin and David Fincher, really balance out each other nicely. And why I think it's maybe the best movie for each of them. That David Fincher's sort of visual stylism and cynicism is often combated with the optimism and written ability of someone like Sorkin that really balance together nicely and come together to have that sort of perfect balance of success and failure, and that back and forth, the sort of dualities of the two men coming together to develop this sort of perfectly balanced kind of a movie. And the movie is perfectly balanced, perfectly edited. Every scene leads into the next. The score is just really great to adding to that dialogue, the sort of propulsive energy, which happens in Steve Jobs, but also happens here. That so much of a great Sorkin script, for example, the dialogue that's being said has to do with the score and how that sort of propels and adds to the beat and the rhythm, because so much of Sorkin's dialogue is a rhythm, but so much of the sort of Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross score is about matching the rhythm of the dialogue and just giving that sort of extra bass. It's like if Sorkin's rhythm was just a guitar, they're giving them the drums and then adding it to a little bit more of a song and building it towards a more effective and impactful way that Sorkin wanted on the script. You know, it's a modern day movie about society, about the way our social interactions are, about love, about friendship, but it does all that with being incredibly entertaining. That it's not too heady, that it's not too in your face or too philosophical in a way, that it talks about a lot of these things, and there's a lot of things compacted into it, but in a great 2-hour movie that's interesting, that's entertaining, that it's really recommended to everyone. It's a total achievement in filmmaking. I love the movie, and I of course recommend it to everyone if you haven't seen it. I think I wouldn't be surprised, and I'm not even mad at it, for example, at being the #1. It's not my favorite movie of the decade, but I think it may be the best movie of the decade. So that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know some of your picks of the top 10 biopics of the next decade, and try to predict my next video, my #1 biopic of the decade, which I'll be talking about in next week's video. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. At the timestamps once again in the description. That's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.